Hi, good morning. My name is Ethan Rittenauer. I am an educator for the Artesian Alliance, which is the Cheehaw Park and Zoo, the Thronatisca Heritage Center, and the Flint River Aquarium here in Albany. Today, I am going to talk to you guys a little bit about coral reef ecology. So let's just make sure that we are all on the same page. Whenever I say coral reef ecology, let's break that down into its three words. We've got coral, we've got reef, and we've got ecology. So let's start with coral. So what is a coral? Um, well, a coral, a lot of people look at coral and they think that it looks a lot like a plant, but it is, in fact, an animal. I have a couple examples of fossilized coral. Um, right here. And we'll be looking at more photos of coral here later, but these are some fossilized pieces of coral. Um, and so coral is a type of animal, believe it or not. Um, they grow, uh, they attach themselves to things and then they grow. And you get these, the reason why they look a lot like plants is because they actually fill a similar role to plants. They are a shelter for other animals. They collect nutrients from the water, um, and they just fulfill a very similar role. Um, so coral looks a lot like plant, but it is not. It is actually an animal. Um, They are consumers instead of producers. So all plants are producers. They actually consume food, believe it or not. Um, so uh, that's what a coral is. There's actually two kinds of coral, and we'll talk about this more here in just a moment, but there's hard coral and there's soft coral. Soft coral tends to be a little bit more wavy, free floating, whereas hard coral tends to be a lot more rigid. Now, the two examples that I showed you here, these are both hard corals, um, or at least fossils of hard corals. Uh, Depending on where they are found, they tend to be hard or soft corals. Actually, right off of the coast of Georgia and down into Florida, there are a lot of soft corals um, found around there. So that's what a coral is. It's an animal that looks a lot like a plant. They're all spongy looking. They twist out and stretch. There's a whole bunch of them. I think they kind of look like brains sometimes whenever they're all collected together. But so now we've got coral. Now let's talk about what a reef is. A reef is a structure. It is a whole bunch of corals that get together and form a huge cluster. Um, so whenever I put the two words together, a coral reef, I'm describing what is essentially a forest of coral. Now, I know I'm using the term forest, and that usually would describe trees, but we're talking about the animals that are a coral. Now, coral, they don't tend to move around a lot whenever they're adults. They might move a little bit on their where they're attached to, but they stick to whatever they're growing to. Um, and then ecology. Ecology is probably the hardest word to define out of the three. Um, Ecology is the study of living and non-living things in an ecosystem and how they interact with each other. So how in, say, a forest, how the trees affect the dirt, which affects the growth of the tree again, and affects all the animals that live in the tree, and how those animals affect the growth of the forest. And it's all just these interconnected pathways. And so that's what ecology is. So I'm going to share my screen here because we're going to follow a PowerPoint. We are going to see a little bit more about what we are looking at. So coral reef ecology. So let's talk a little bit about coral reefs. Coral reefs are sometimes called the rainforests of the ocean. That's because rainforests are often regarded as the most biodiverse ecosystems on the planet on land. Whereas coral reefs are actually the most diverse ecosystem total, period. So both in water and out of water, there's more life per square inch of a coral reef than there is anywhere else in the world, even more than the rainforests. They are, in fact, it's estimated that around a quarter of all ocean fish rely on coral reefs for food, shelter, reproduction, or any combination of those. So they're kind of a big deal. They're like a city. You know how out in the countryside there might be a few people every mile or so, but whenever you get into a city, it gets real dense. There are so many people in cities. Well, a coral reef is a lot like a city, just with all kinds of different creatures living in it. And we're going to talk a little bit more about the kinds of creatures that live in a coral reef. There are coral reefs, as I said, just off the coast of Georgia and Florida. They can be found generally in more tropical areas. You kind of have to get this sweet spot where you've got shallow tropics and calm, consistent weather, because coral reefs need really warm water, and but it can't be too hot. So they need warm but not hot water, and they need it to stay a pretty consistent temperature. It can't really vary very much. So it needs to stay pretty much the same year round. And it needs to be relatively shallow because a lot of the creatures that live in it rely on sunlight, and at night, moonlight. But so all of these factors need to come together to make coral reefs. So usually coral reefs are near islands or just off the shore of a mainland, and it has to be relatively tropical. The largest example of a coral reef is the Great Barrier Reef in Australia, which I'm sure many of you have heard about before. The Great Barrier Reef is this extremely large system of coral reefs that goes all the way from the northern coast of Australia down towards central Australia. It is absolutely massive. And I'm talking, it's on the east side of Australia. So what exactly is coral? We talked about this a little bit. An individual coral is called a polyp. So they're just these tiny little things, these individual pieces of coral. And when they're grouped together, they form colonies. Hard coral tends to form reefs, whereas soft coral, it doesn't exactly form a reef. It's not technically a reef, but they also cluster together in these colonies. And then all kinds of other animals and plants actually make their home on or around coral. And we're going to talk about a few examples here. So hard coral, actually, we're gonna get to this in just a moment. I want to show you guys some cool animals that you might find on a coral reef. The first one is obviously coral. So this is fossilized coral, and as you can see, it's got a whole bunch of little kind of ridges and bumps all over it. And I want you to imagine it almost looks like a branch. I'll have pictures of coral here in just a moment, don't worry. But it looks like a branch. There's all of these branching pieces of coral sticking out, and kind of like a tree in the forest is a home for a lot of animals. A lot of animals use coral as a home. I don't have any live animals for you, but I do have a couple biofacts, which are just biological remnants of different animals. In this case, I have several dried up and preserved animals that we might find around a coral reef. The first one I want to show you guys is this little guy right here. This is a seahorse. Seahorses make their homes around coral reefs. They will attach themselves to a piece of coral, and it kind of looks exactly like they belong there whenever they're attached there. They'll just sit and wait, and it'll be really, really hard to tell if you've ever seen videos of these guys in their natural environment. It's basically impossible to tell where they are if they're not already moving. So these guys are actually fish, believe it or not. They're kind of weird looking, seahorses. And they're called seahorses because their face kind of resembles a horse. And the way that they move in the water is a little bit awkward. They've got fins all the way up here behind the head. And so they're moving around on their head and they'll attach to a piece of coral and they'll just kind of swivel. And they'll let go if they think they need to and hop over to another piece of coral. But very, very interesting. Um, some other creatures you might find around a coral reef are sea stars. Sea stars can be found around coral reefs. I have another example of a sea star here. You can see that they look very different, but because there's a lot of different kinds of sea stars, but they all generally resemble a star because they've got the five points of symmetry here. Sea stars generally hang around coral reefs. They tend to hang more towards the top of a coral reef. They'll live in what's known as intertidal zones pretty often, which means that they live really close to the surface. And as the tides roll out, they might find themselves above the water and they'll slowly migrate back into the water. And then whenever the tide comes back in, they'll come back up onto the shore and eat whatever the tide washes. Other creatures you might find, sea sponge. Um, your sponge at home might actually be made out of made out of sea sponge. Though I think nowadays they tend to be artificial. Sea sponges are, believe it or not, animals. If you feel them, they feel exactly like a sponge. They lack really any kind of internal organ. Sometimes they have just one tube goes through their whole body, and that's it. That's what they got. That's how they digest food. But believe it or not, a sponge is an animal, like SpongeBob. SpongeBob is a real thing, though usually not a square. That tends to be whenever we bring them up on the shore and we cut them into squares to use. But yeah, sea sponges will hang around coral reefs, and they'll use the coral reef for food. They'll hunt for food around a coral reef. They'll use it for shelter. A lot of different kinds of fish live in the coral reefs. I have two examples here. This one's a spinefish. This one's a porcupine fish. Um, uh, these guys will swim around, usually a lot more brightly colored than this. They'll swim around a coral reef and they'll use it for shelter. They'll hunt for food around a coral reef because a lot of animals rely on coral for shelter. And so larger fish will hunt for those animals. You'll find sharks all over coral reefs as well. And they'll come in and they'll try to eat whatever they can find, maybe plants, maybe smaller animals. And you just get this really long chain of animals eating other animals, eating other animals, eating other animals around a coral reef because there are just so many kinds of animals that live there. Other examples of animals that you might find around a coral reef are clams. This one's obviously opened and polished, but clams will hang out around coral reefs. They're filter feeders, so they will just eat whatever comes near them. You might find this is a very white calcified crab, but obviously underwater it would be more red than this, but you might find different kinds of crabs under the water around coral reefs. And all of these examples of animals use the place as a home to find food. They use it to keep shelter. Like imagine it's like a rabbit hiding in a bramble bush to avoid larger predators. Fish will hide within coral, and it'll be much harder for other creatures to get to them. Octopus live in coral reefs. They live all over the place, but a lot of octopus live in coral reefs, and they'll use their many limbs and really, really snug bodies to sneak into tiny little burrows and hunt small fish. So I'm going to share my screen again, and we're going to talk a little bit about, we've talked about what lives in a coral reef and what can be found in and around coral reefs, but let's talk a little bit about the structure of coral reefs and some of the challenges that are facing coral reefs, because I guarantee you, you will very rarely see anybody talk about coral reefs unless they're going to talk about the fact that they are under threat. So we're going to talk about exactly what that means, what kinds of threats coral reefs face, and how we can work on it, how we can treat these threats and try to solve them. So let's talk about hard coral, because that's what we're really talking about when we're talking about coral reefs. Hard coral forms through a process known as calcification. So what happens is it takes carbonate, which is this chemical, this thing. Bicarbonate is found just around in the water. It's these tiny little particles of it's essentially chalk, and they will take calcium and they will combine them through a chemical process in their body, and it will create their shell. They'll form these shells out of calcium carbonate. It's actually what most crabs' shells are made out of. It's what oyster shells are made out of. Sea stars even use calcium carbonate to make their hard shells on the outside. It's a very, very essential process. And they get this bicarbonate because it's freely in the water. There's a lot of it within our ocean, and it comes out of rock. What happens is the rock gets worn away by the ocean, and then the bicarbonate ends up in the water, and that's how, and then it just kind of floats around in the water. It's just a particle in the water, and it's extremely essential for these creatures, these hard-shelled creatures like snails and sea stars and even crabs and things like that. They rely on this bicarbonate to make their shells. It's kind of like if you didn't get some of your vitamins, you would not be as strong. It's those got milk ads. Milk is an excellent source of calcium. It's said that milk will make your bones strong. Well, they need bicarbonate like we need milk, if that makes any sense. So one of the threats, and this is a really big one, this is a huge threat that these creatures that live around coral reefs and actually throughout the ocean face, but we're going to talk specifically about the ones in coral reefs, is what's known as ocean acidification. Ocean acidification is sometimes called climate change's evil silent brother, because it is just as devastating, but it doesn't get talked about as much. And I think the reason is because it's a little bit hard to understand. So I'm going to do my best to explain it here in a way that makes sense. So basically, I already explained how these animals need carbonate, which they get from bicarbonate in the water. They need carbonate to form their shells. They need calcium carbonate, and they provide the calcium and they get the carbonate, and they come together and make calcium carbonate, and that's how they get their shells. It's like a vitamin. But the problem is, because of ocean acidification, there are less carbonate ions because it tends to form what's known as carbonic acid instead. So what happens is our atmosphere, the amount of carbon dioxide in our atmosphere, which I'm sure is a term you've heard before, carbon dioxide, that's this stuff right over here. The amount of carbon dioxide in our atmosphere has gone up like a lot in the last 100 years or so. It's gone up a ton, way more than the Earth can really handle. If it went up gradually, very slowly, what happens is the ocean collects carbon dioxide and just dissolves it in the water. And this is usually how the ocean kind of regulates the Earth. The air does not get too high in carbon dioxide because gradually over time it dissolves within the ocean. But because so much of it has been released, what's happening is the ocean is not able to handle the sheer amount that it's absorbing, and the ocean is becoming more acidic. Normally, the ocean is a little bit basic. It has a pH of about 8.2. For reference, if an ocean was not, if water is perfectly pH balanced, pH neutral, it has a pH of 7. So right now it has a pH of 8.2, or it did. It had a pH of 8.2. So it's a little bit basic. Basic is whenever it has a higher pH, and acidic is whenever it has a lower pH. So it's a little bit basic. Um, and so, but we've studied and we've noticed that within the last 100 years, the pH of the water has actually dropped to 8.1, which doesn't sound like a lot, but pH, every single increment in pH is 10 times more than the last one. So the difference between a pH of 8.1 and a pH of 8.2 is 10 times. The difference between a pH of 8 and a pH of 7 is 10 times. It's always going to be 10 times more. So this extremely small increment is actually a lot bigger than you think it is. So it's gotten more acidic. It's dropped in its pH. And the reason why is because whenever carbon dioxide reacts with water, it forms what's called carbonic acid. And it releases hydrogen into the water. So you've got this free-floating hydrogen around. And these carbonate ions that these animals like shells and oysters and crabs and sea stars all rely on to make their shells, these vitamins that they're getting. It's like whenever these vitamins will just react with the hydrogen and form more acid. So instead of going to the animals, it's going to the acid instead. It would be like if you are trying to bake a cake and you need flour to make a cake. But whenever you get to the store, you find that somebody else has bought all the flour in the store. So now you don't have enough flour to make your cake. These shelled creatures, like this clam here, are trying to make their shells like making a cake, but they don't have the carbonate in order to actually make a full shell. And so instead, they're just having less shells. And actually, you can see it here. The shells just get thinner and thinner and thinner because they've got less carbonate to make. They can't use as much because it's getting turned into acid too quickly. So all of these creatures end up getting weaker and weaker shells until they become deformed, like you see in the bottom corner here. That's a very deformed snail shell. And so the snails, they're not going to be able to survive with a deformed shell like that. And so what's happening is we're not getting enough carbonate in our water to replenish the amount that the acid is taking away. And so the increased acidity in the ocean is making these shells not form as well. Some other things that are happening before we talk about coral bleaching is with the higher acid, it's making some animals react differently. So fish are behaving differently in the water because the water is chemically different now. We've noticed that some animals are more sluggish, less reactive. It'd be like if you eat a bunch of food, you don't want to go run a mile afterwards, right? These fish are, because of the higher acidity, they're just not moving as quickly, and it's allowing them to get eaten a lot faster and killed off a lot more. Like clownfish, for instance, they hide in an enemy, like you've seen in Finding Nemo, maybe. They hide in an enemy, but we've noticed that with higher pH, or with lower pHs, sorry, with more acidity, they don't hide anymore. They just kind of sit there, and something might come up and eat them now, and they don't even react to it. So why does this affect coral? Well, aside from just making the shells and animals, making it harder for them to live, it also affects coral as well. So the bleaching, there's a thing called coral bleaching, and you might have heard about it because a really big deal. It's been happening a lot to the creatures in coral reefs, specifically the coral. I said at the beginning that coral reefs rely on a very stable temperature. They need it to be warm, but not too hot. And it can't be too cold. Otherwise, they're not going to be able to survive. So they need a very, very specific kind of temperature. In fact, a temperature difference of only 2 degrees Celsius can cause what's known as coral bleaching. And it's what happens whenever the coral dies. So before it dies, it's going to turn white, and then it will just die after a short period of time, maybe a few months. It'll just be dead, and it will never be able to be revived because once something is dead, it's gone. Climate change, global climate change, is driving the global temperature up. And global climate change is caused by a whole bunch of things. I'm sure you've heard about it before. Things like increased carbon emissions, which is what I've been talking about here with ocean acidification. Higher levels of CO2 in the air actually make it warmer. Other things like pollution drive global climate change. Using fossil fuels instead of more renewable energies drives climate change. All of these things tend to create climate change. And it's a very complicated and very large topic of study that I'm not going to go too into detail here, but just understand that it is causing the temperature, the global temperature, to increase slowly every year on average. So the warmer temperatures, it's causing the acidification process to speed up, and it's also causing these coral reefs to bleach and then die. Between 2014 and 2017, actually, just in that 3-year span, 75% of the world's coral experienced enough heat to bleach, and 30% of all coral life on the planet died in those 3 years. That's a lot. I just said that they were like cities, right? That's a lot, like a ton of coral packed into one place. And you can see this is what coral looks like. All of these things, these are all examples of coral. And then this is a similar reef after it experienced coral bleaching. And you notice that there are still a few fish around, but the fish, after the coral bleaches, there will be way less nutrients in the coral, and the fish will leave because they will no longer have a source of food. And so they will seek out new forms of shelter, or they will die. It's one or the other. They're going to have to move. They're going to have to adapt to the bleached coral, which they can't do because there's no food, or they're going to have to die. So it's a real big problem. You can't, once a coral reef's dead, it's dead. There is no real bringing it back, which is a real bummer. But don't worry. We're working on it. People are working on it. People are dedicated towards trying to solve this problem. There's a lot of ways that people are working to solve the problem. One of the big ways, right off the bat, is trying to prevent it from happening further, right? So trying to cut off and stop coral bleaching from being a thing that's going to happen moving forward. You can do that by protecting coral reefs through government intervention. So establishing a nature preserve, making sure that any fishing or dumping of trash or anything in the ocean is heavily regulated and managed. Just trying to control as much as you possibly can for things. Trying to make sure that the coral reef environment is exactly how it needs to be in order to thrive. Another thing that happens is community engagement, which we're technically doing right now just by me talking to you about it. You talk about it, you engage with people, you explain what the problem is, because if enough people know what the problem is and care enough, usually a problem can, if not be solved, at least fixed a little bit, right? So there are all kinds of groups of people who are encouraging people. So like the Great Barrier Reef, it's a very popular place for people to go diving and scuba diving to go look at the creatures. So they're encouraging safe scuba diving. Don't pick up coral and take it home with you as a souvenir. Don't grab animals that are down there and take them home. Either try not to damage anything as you're scuba diving. Don't leave a bunch of waste behind. All of these things are these community-based practices that people are trying to implement. And some of them are regulated by the government, but other ones are just strictly people agreeing not to hurt the coral reefs anymore. And then the last big thing that we're doing to try to solve it is scientific action. There are new methods of combating coral bleaching and all of that. There's a whole ton of ideas that people are using to try to combat coral reefs dying off. One of them is kind of novel. We started doing it, I think, 2 years ago. Right whenever, if we can catch it early enough, right whenever coral reefs are starting to bleach but haven't died completely yet, some people have put speakers under the water, essentially, and are just playing sounds of animals that you might find at a coral reef. So like fish swimming around, things like that. And the sound of these animals swimming around actually attracts more animals to come, and also tricks the coral into thinking that the animals are back and it will come back to life. It's so weird. It kind of, I have a big old grin whenever I think about it, because it's very funny to me that the way that we are trying to keep coral alive is by just sort of tricking everyone involved into thinking that it's alive. So you trick the fish into thinking that the coral is alive by playing the sounds of fish. It would be like it's like in those cartoons where like somebody's like, "Oh man, it sure is awesome in this beautiful place over here," and then like other people come walking over to see what the beautiful place is, and now all of a sudden you've got a ton of people here. Like, it's so wild. Other ways that we are trying to keep coral alive, because just making sound, while it is helpful, is not a good solution in and of itself. You usually have to do more than just that. So like mimicking sound is great, but what if the coral's still dying? Then you've just got all these animals showing up to this coral reef and no way to feed them, so the animals are just going to die. So what you do is you also do a couple other things in addition. One of them is growing coral in a nursery. So you can see down here in the bottom left, this is actually what a coral nursery looks like. They attach coral and they grow it, and they let it grow up. And then they will transplant it and put it in places where they think that a reef would make sense at. Maybe an old reef that has been bleached, they clean it up and they put new coral in, or possibly an entirely new location. Another way that they are combating it is by building new reefs, which is what you can see over here in this corner. Old structures, a lot of times old sunken ships, they might sink ships after taking anything dangerous off of them. This is a jungle gym that somebody had just constructed and put at the bottom of the ocean. It gives it's a great anchoring point for coral to latch onto. And what you can do is you can actually maintain it and clean it up, and make sure that everything is working properly there. Now let's talk about what we can do, just specifically, me and you guys at home. There's a lot of things that we can do to try to keep our coral reefs alive. So I mentioned that one of the big problems is ocean acidification, and that's caused by carbon dioxide in the air. And carbon dioxide, one of the big contributors of carbon dioxide are factories and vehicles and other appliances. Like for instance, your power, I know it's electricity, but it's made in a factory somewhere in a generator, and that generator is usually powered by something like coal or natural gas, or sometimes even a renewable resource like wind or solar, um, depending on where you're at. But basically, if you remember to turn out the lights whenever you leave a room and you plan your trips in advance to the grocery store so you don't end up going back to the grocery store a little bit later, and you make sure that whenever you're getting a new light bulb, you get a light bulb that's going to last a lot longer and doesn't use as much energy, or all these other methods are excellent for just conserving energy. If you conserve energy and your neighbor conserves energy and your neighbor's neighbor conserves energy and all of you guys agree to try to conserve as much energy as possible, then um, it actually adds up to a whole lot of energy being conserved. Um, Another problem that's facing coral reefs is pollutants. And actually, the biggest single source of pollution nowadays is fertilizers. It's runoff from farms and gardens and homes. So if you are planting a garden, you can use fertilizer, but don't overdo it with the fertilizer. Make sure that you use fertilizer that comes from a good source. So there is no better source than somebody that you know, right? So if you know somebody who produces fertilizer, I know here um, at Chiha we have plenty of animals that produce plenty of of stuff that we might use as fertilizer. Um, but you can get your fertilizer, you can make fertilizer, and just trying to reduce your use of so much fertilizer. It's actually really impacting pollution in the water. And you might not think about it here, wherever it is you're at. I know I'm here on the Flint River in Georgia, but the Flint River flows down in the Apalachicola Bay, which flows into the Gulf. So everything that I do affects all of those coral reefs down in Florida. Every single thing that I do. And that's kind of a crazy thought, right? Everything that you do affects these coral reefs. Another thing that you can do is recycle and reduce your food waste and other trash waste. So, just if whatever it is you're going to eat, make sure that you only take what you know you're going to eat, and then you can always take more. That way you're not just wasting tons of food and throwing it in a landfill, or maybe having it get burned or anything like that. Another major problem with coral reefs is people are buying tropical fish that are just caught from coral reefs. So if you are a tropical fish enthusiast, try to make sure that you know where your fish are coming from. So don't buy fish from tropical fish that you know are from coral reefs. Some fish are even fished from coral reefs. There's overfishing in coral reefs, which is also upsetting the balance. So make sure that you just know where you're getting your food from. Another thing that you could do, and I know you guys are in 6th grade, so this might seem like a big step, but you can contact legislators showing your concern about coral reefs. I know that whenever I was in 6th grade, I contacted legislators about things as school projects in my social studies class, and I'm sure that you guys can do exactly the same. And you might even be surprised; they might send you some information back, and they might even be swayed to do something. You never know until you try. So these are all things that you can do. And another thing, the biggest thing that you can probably do is to talk about it with people, to let people know what's going on. This problem is not going to go away. It is a fairly big problem, and we are working on it. There are already programs in place in pretty much every coral reef on the planet to try to mitigate the issues, to try to solve the problems. Like down in Key West, there's a whole bunch of really dedicated scientists who are working on ways to keep the Key West coral reefs alive. There's a ton of people out on the coast of Georgia making sure that their reefs stay alive as well. It is just a problem that is not going to go away, and it is always going to be a problem, probably for as long as we are around. Um, so it is just something that you should be more conscious of. Um, it is not all doom and gloom. There are ways that we can help and our coral reefs, and there are ways that you personally can help your coral reefs just by reducing your impact, trying to stay, um, just being more mindful about what you do, recycling your plastics, not throwing away um, excess food and other garbage that you can use, um, making sure that you don't overuse fertilizers if you're planting a garden. All of these are examples of things that you can do that will directly help a coral reef. And it'll also probably lead to just a cleaner life and a better life. So even if you don't care about the coral reefs, it's a great thing to do anyways. So this has been my talk on coral reefs. Um, I hope you enjoyed it. Um, it seems like a really big and insurmountable challenge, but I assure you that there are all kinds of people who are working on it. And maybe if you grow older and dedicate yourself to it, you might be able to help solve this problem as well. Um, so I thank you very much for coming to my lecture on coral reef ecology. I hope you enjoyed it, and I will see you next time. Thank you very much.